So, what I wanted you to do to start off with was to close your eyes and imagine a scenario. You don't have to close your eyes, but just imagine a scenario. So, you're piloting an Airbus A380. You've got 300 passengers and crew on board. You do 550 knots, and you hit fog. So you have a bit of a wobble, as you would. But you say to yourself, it's okay. Speed's okay, altitude's okay. Your co-pilot, who's sat next to you, turns to look at you, and you're just about to open your mouth when three things happen. Firstly, a red light starts flashing on the dashboard. You're running out of fuel. Oops. And then suddenly there's a warning light. Your starboard engine is overheating. And then the door to the cabin crashes open, and the chief stewardess marches in and says, Captain, the engine's smoking. What are we going to do? So you can open your eyes now, those of you who didn't have them closed. And that was an analogy. So the analogy is that you're running a franchise and you're only focused on the revenue, which is your speed, or you're only focused on the customer satisfaction, which is your altitude. But you've forgotten all about your operating systems. So you've got rubbish processes. Your staff hate you because they've got to key in data in this system over here, this system over here, and this system over here. And they're using post-it notes and whatever. So they're completely fried. So your engine's overheating. And then you're not training anybody up. Nobody's got the skills you need to man the business up, so you're running out of fuel. So that's the whole idea behind the spoiler alert, which is the Kaplan and Norton balanced scorecard. And I'm going to talk about it today as to managing a franchise network, but actually, for those of you who aren't running franchise networks, it applies to all businesses of all kinds. So it's a good idea for any business, regardless of whether you use Aedon.Accounting, whether you run a school, service, construction, whatever it might be. The balanced scorecard is a good way of looking at your business because it makes you look at the business in the whole. But it's particularly effective if you're managing a franchise network. So, what happens in your franchise network if you ask your franchisees to supply you with these rounded metrics on these four quadrants in the colours there, which we'll come to in a moment? Well, the first thing is what they call in the business schools the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is that you change your behaviour if you are being monitored. And I think that makes sense. Another way of putting it is Big Brother is watching you. So you will behave. So when they were doing studies on different hand washes during COVID, trying to figure out what's the best way to wash your hands, the trouble was every time they did a study, everybody washed their hands. Whereas as soon as they didn't do a study, nobody washed their hands. That's the Hawthorne effect if you wish to be posh. There's also a thing called the science of comparison. Again, that's how they call it at Harvard. And the science of comparison is that if you have a league table for your franchisees and they can see how they compete with each other, they will change their performance. they should be, good franchisees are competitive. So they will compete with each other naturally, and they will try and learn off each other to get better. If you're smart though, you can also have different levels of benchmarks. So for your star performers, you might have a high threshold. For your average, a medium one, and for your new franchisees, a different one altogether. Because they're all at different stages in the journey, and measuring them all against the same yardstick doesn't make a lot of sense. You might call it survival of the fittest as well. Because if you know how people are doing, you can see who needs the encouragement and perhaps who needs more coaching and so on, and who's not performing in the way that you want your franchise to perform or your business to perform if you're not running a franchise. You also create a common language amongst your franchisees. You can kind of set what they are going to be talking about. So by defining a set of metrics, those are the metrics that the franchisees will discuss amongst each other. When they're talking to each other, behind the franchisor's back, they will compare their performance on the scorecard metrics that you've defined. So you kind of set the language. In 1984, George Orwell's 1984, which I'm sure we all read at school, but I've forgotten, it's called Newspeak. So there's Old Speak in 1984, and there's Newspeak, and the distinguishing feature of Newspeak is that the vocabulary reduces every year. Entirely relevant to franchising, but you know, interesting thing to know. So, Kaplan and Norton Balanced Scorecard. Kaplan was a Harvard Business School professor. I first read his work back in 1982 when I was at the LSE, and headed up the research arm of Pete Marwick on business studies and business performance. The two of them got together and they came up with the Balanced Scorecard, and that was first published in about 1991, 92, and it's kind of been adopted sort of globally as the best way to manage businesses going forward. So you take four perspectives: the financial perspective, the customer perspective, an internal process perspective, and a learning and growth perspective. And the whole point is you don't focus on one thing in isolation. And it was interesting, there is a counter school of metrics which says you should have a North Star metric, one single thing that you focus on. And the AI tool that I use, Gemini, absolutely refused to allow me to put North Star metrics in this thing. It's completely contrary to the whole notion of the balanced scorecard. The balanced scorecard is that you've got to maintain a balance. It isn't just about top line growth. It's about building a sustainable business, which means that all of those metrics must be performing properly. We can see you. We've got a 360-degree view of what you're doing. Now, the example I'm just going to illustrate this with now is we've built a demo system with a few metrics in it on the handout that you can't read, which are all around the Nightingale's musical school, which is about a franchise where we are selling after school singing and music lessons to primary school children. So very relevant to the back over here. And Aedon, I'm sure all of you know from your Latin, is the Latin for Nightingale. Hence the reason we like to do musical kind of analogies. So the first metric that all franchisees and all businesses look at is obviously the top line. Everybody measures the total revenue, the gross margin, and the price profitability. But yeah, I don't think we get. Can you see which is so Bristol and Oxford are the two top performers? Can you see that? I might come over here. Wait. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay, so The top two performers here are, I think it's Bristol and Oxford. So if you were just to look at this from a revenue perspective, you'd say those guys are the top dogs in your franchise network. Those are the people who are the star performers. They're up for Franchisee of the Year. Gross margins, very similar. Pricing, a bit different. So Bristol is here. They're charging £741 per pupil, whereas Oxford are only charging £587. So quite a difference there. So perhaps an alarm bell, or at least something to think about. If now we look at the customer perspectives, this is, again, and this is entirely fictitious, by the way. This is entirely out of my brain last Saturday, so don't worry about any of the specifics here are entirely arbitrary. These are a bit complicated to see in this thing. You can actually play them up bigger when you're using the software, so they are a bit at the moment. But the idea is, if we look here at the customer net promoter score, and we've lost Oxford off the scale here, Oxford is this one, the brown one, but Bristol is down here. So the customer satisfaction from Bristol is distinctly iffy. So though they're charging lots of money for these lessons, clients aren't so happy with them. Pupil count is similar. The churn, which is the rate at which they're losing pupils, so the number who are re-signing every year, again, Bristol is in bad books up here. Not quite as bad as Cheltenham, they're the worst, but versus Oxford, Oxford are down here, and their churn is much lower, and that's better. So suddenly, Bristol aren't looking quite as rosy as they did at the start of the presentation, whereas if you just looked at the revenue, you'd say they were marvellous. So that's the customer perspective, very important perspective, obviously. Then if we look at the lessons delivered, actually I think those are fairly similar, and I think the pass rates are very similar. So on the operating metrics, and those are fairly similar, but if you look at the pupil ratios, Bristol, interesting, got 8.5 and Oxford nearly 10. Not sure I'm going to read into that, but again, you must excuse me. This is a little bit arbitrary. The whole backstory is not properly filled out, so there may be just errors in my data. And then if we look at the teacher net promoter scores, Bristol are down here and Oxford are up here. So what do the staff think of them? Well, the staff love Oxford, but they're not so keen on Bristol. So the point really of that exercise is that it's not necessarily obvious who is the best performer if you look beyond revenue on its own. And you should be considering all these statistics when you're measuring the performance of not just a franchise business, but any business. And this scorecard applies to any business, big or small. Whatever you do, it applies to my business, your business, everybody's business. It's a good way of measuring your business. So it's worth looking at kind of from that perspective. Just in terms of our tool, in terms of building all this stuff and building scorecards and so forth, that dashboard, this is an AI-generated picture, you may have guessed, took me 1 hour, 4 minutes and 20 seconds to build, which is my personal best. And I'm not Olympic standard at building dashboards, but they're pretty bloody easy to build, is the point really. So the tool that we sell, building these sophisticated dashboards is remarkably easy, and you learn to do it yourself, and they're not hard. That's the point I'm making there. We also help if you are running a franchise, and I appreciate this is, I think, potentially only one person in the audience here, so I'm just talking to the gentleman at the back really here. Some of the things we also help with specifically are managing franchise money. So if you collect the money and then on behalf of the franchisees and then push it out to the franchisees, that's called client money. It's not your money. It should go in an escrow bank account, and you should really maintain separate books of account for each of the franchisees for that, separate ledger statements for that. And the accounting for that is quite sophisticated, and you cannot do it in Xero, QuickBooks, Sage, all that lot. They just don't do it. So you end up having to manage it in Excel, and it's just wrong because it never reconciles. Whereas you do it in Aedon, we manage it properly with ledgers for each individual franchisee, so you know exactly what's going on. We also give complete transparency to all the transactions between the franchise and the franchisee, because particularly if you get busy, there's lots of stuff going through the franchise statement and people like to know where they're up to. So you get visibility of that as well as to the performance metrics. And we also do year-end tax statements to assist with the franchisees' tax statements, because often, depending on the nature of the franchise, they're not so good at that. So we have been working with a major slimming franchise, and their franchisees are, struggle at the year end to produce their income statements and expense statements, and this just allows them to fulfill that. The other thing I'd just like to say to you and promote to you while I'm stood here is the power of AI. So this, the front page of your document there, the handout, was entirely built by AI using that prompt. I didn't write a single word of it. I asked the right questions because I knew the right questions to ask, because, AI is like having a smart graduate working with you. Sometimes they're amazing and sometimes they're remarkably stupid. And they sort of flip-flop between the two. And AI, in my experience, is a bit like that. Sometimes it just is staggeringly clever, and other times it just will not do what it should do. But in this instance, I was blown away that it built that handout for me in literally the time it took me to create that prompt, write it in, and it built the whole damn thing for me, which I think is pretty bloody clever. So, if any of that is of any interest whatsoever, we're over there. But whatever your business, whatever you do commercially, the Kaplan Norton balanced scorecard is a damn good idea.